Alright, so this is another lecture video. This is on the Crito. So the Crito takes place, Socrates is in prison awaiting his execution, just like the Phaedo, and he's visited by a student of his named Crito. And remember that Socrates has been convicted and he's awaiting his execution in a kind of, jail. So Crito is a young man of means, and he has one central goal in this dialogue, which is to convince Socrates to escape. So because he's of means, he has access to a boat, and he tells Socrates that the boat is ready to set sail and take him to some other land. And so the dialogue consists of Crito's arguments in order to convince Socrates to do so. So there are two central arguments that Crito puts forth. One is that, isn't Socrates concerned with his friends and family? So Socrates has, several students, including the people that we've seen: Crito, Cebes, Simmias, Plato, and others. And Crito is appealing to Socrates: once you think about your friends and family, you have a social and familial responsibility to them, and if you allowed yourself to be executed, and executed in Crito's estimation unjustly, then wouldn't you be doing a disservice to your friends and family? And so that's one line of argument. The second line of argument is not, from Crito, is less altruistic, and he's saying, think about me and my reputation. Here I am, a student of yours, people know this, and they're going to expect me to try to convince you, and they're going to, be disappointed with me if I fail to convince you, especially since, I have the means. So, don't let me fail. Don't let me fail, these other people and sully my reputation if I'm not, if I can't convince you. So Socrates, of course, refuses these gestures, and the central argument is built on something that he established in the Apology, and it's going to be something that when we get to Rousseau, we're going to turn to as well, and that something is social contract theory. So the basic idea behind the social contract is that when you join society, when you stay in society, when you agree to follow the laws of society, you give up a certain amount of freedom that you would have if you did not exist in that society and you were not under the scope of laws and you just did whatever you wanted whenever. Philosophers call that scenario the state of nature. So you give up some amount of freedom and autonomy to join society, but then you get certain things back from it. You get, for example, the protection of police and military. You get to participate in an economy. You get schools like Missouri State, which are publicly funded. You get parks. You get roads. You get access to all this, infrastructure. And so you're benefited. And so the agreement between the individual and the state is one of, mutual benefit. The citizen, the individual, agrees to follow the laws, and they're benefited by what society gives them, how society protects them, and what society enables them to do. So think back to the Apology. Socrates says that he is in debt to the city of Athens, that he sort of owes the city of Athens. And he owes the city of Athens because Athens was, partly responsible for allowing Socrates to become who he was. So Socrates participated in the military, and he was said to have done, quite well there. Athens gave him an education. Athens allowed him, the freedom, that is until he was arrested and executed, the freedom to go around conversing with people, the political liberty to have students follow him around, and all of us are in some way or another partly constituted by our social environments, including the cities and towns and states that we live in. And so even in the ancient world, Socrates recognized this. So he certainly is sensitive, somewhat to the idea that the first argument of Crito is that he would be, leaving his kids behind, he would be leaving his friends behind. But remember that for Socrates, as also, what he established in the Apology, was that he, felt not only in debt to his city, but that he wasn't going to go back on his moral principles. The good life for Socrates is not when you're pursuing the goals and the pleasures of the body, but rather the goals and pleasures of the mind. And one of the last things he said was that a good person cannot be harmed by others. So for the meaning of life for Socrates is to try to understand ideas in themselves, which is a pursuit of the soul, and then the second pursuit of the soul is to become a moral person, to use reason and to live a life strong with moral action, moral virtue, and so forth. And so, while Socrates could have, said something in the trial that would have gotten him out of trouble, he could have said, "I'm so sorry for what I did, dear Miletus, please forgive me, city of Athens, I'll never do it again." And he could have probably found a less groveling way to get himself out of trouble. He didn't want to go back on his moral principles. So yes, he is sensitive to the needs of his family, to the concerns of his students, and, he's sensitive to that. But what takes precedence over that is to live a moral life for Socrates. And he thought that if he were to escape, he would be doing something against that. Now, so why is that? How did we get from living a moral life within this context of social contract theory? So, Socrates says that given the fact that Athens helped produce him, Athens helped raise him, he recognizes that he has a moral obligation to follow the law. To follow the laws of Athens. That's part of his social contract theory, right? And that's pretty much a basic staple of any social contract theory, that citizens have to obey the laws. That's part of the deal that they have to uphold on their end of the bargain. And so, for Socrates to break the law of Athens by escaping, even if he thought it was unjust, would be to renege on his obligation as a citizen to follow the laws, and thus it would be to sort of sully himself as a citizen by doing something unlawful, right? So another thing, recall that Socrates said was against suicide. That's something that also came out in the Apology. He was against suicide because he said, "I'm put here by the gods. The gods sent me on this divine mission to wake Athens up, to be like that gadfly around that tardy steed. I'm on a mission. I'm put here by the gods." So Socrates, thought that you have to man your post. You're given a post by the gods, and you cannot abandon it. And a similar application can be used with regard to his status as a citizen, that as a citizen, he's got to man his post by being an Athenian, by following the laws, and by not breaking them. Or else, just as suicide would renege on his responsibility as a human being with the gods, and that kind of contract, as it were, so too, if he broke the laws of Athens, would he renege on his responsibility as a citizen to Athens. So it's the social contract more than anything else that Socrates is appealing to in refusing Crito's offer. And then the second argument about what will people think of Crito, Socrates is really not, very impressed by, and doesn't have a terribly strong response. But part of the idea is that if people listened to Crito and listened to how he interacted with Socrates and heard Socrates' arguments and at least reported those back, then I think the other students and folks in Athens that were interested in what happened to Socrates would be understanding and forgiving of Crito that he couldn't convince him to escape. So this is interesting, and it really begs this question. So most of us can probably agree that if we take social contract theory seriously, then we have a sort of prima facie obligation to obey the laws of our cities and of our states. But the real question, the real hard ethical, philosophical question that the dialogue Crito raises is, what happens if there is an unjust law? Do we have obligations to follow unjust laws? Because it's suggested that Socrates thinks what's happened to him is unjust. But, what you should have been thinking about as well is, if Socrates thought what happened to him was so unjust, why didn't he try to act in the trial in such a way that he did not go back on his principles, but that he avoided execution? Because clearly you would think that he's smart enough to do that, to not go back on his principles, but to avoid execution. A lot of people speculate that Socrates was trying to martyr himself, historicize himself, by allowing himself to be killed in such a way that he knew, and he was right, that Athens would come to regret. I might have mentioned last time that months or weeks after the trial, they drove Miletus out of town because of the great regret that they felt for having executed one of their most beloved Athenian characters, and who 2,500 years later, you and I and all of us are still talking about. So if Socrates had any intention of making himself a martyr to historicize himself, he was successful, judged by the fact that we in philosophy still talk about him. So maybe that explains some of his motivation to not escape. He was also 80 years old. He had lived a pretty, good life up until that point. Not up until that point, but including that point. So, what about, though, more serious situations where society has very unjust laws? Do citizens have to obey them? So we can highlight some laws in our country that we've had in our country's history, including slavery, Jim Crow, not allowing women the right to vote, not allowing all citizens the same equal rights. For example, those citizens with disability, those haven't always been a set of rights. So what happens when society tells you to do something immoral? How does your moral obligation to be a good person and do the right thing conflict sometimes with your political obligation to obey the laws if you're in a social situation where the political laws are corrupt, if they are immoral? At least in this case, Socrates is saying that we have obligations to follow the law given the basic terms of the social contract. But, this was a case where only Socrates was going to be executed. What if it was a situation in which Athens rounded up every free-thinking, philosophically minded type of person and decided to execute them en masse? Would Socrates go along with that? Or would he allow himself to be executed en masse with everyone else? Or might he have been a little more willing to die, especially given what I told you about his historical a martyr, becoming a historical martyr, would he have allowed himself to do that if it wasn't just him dying, if it were, a lot of people dying? So, you guys should be thinking about whether or not you would escape in such a situation. And even if you decided to follow in the footsteps of Socrates, what would happen if more serious laws that were legal but that threatened the moral health and the lives and status of people, would you continue to follow them? How far does social contract theory go when laws become unjust? Alright, that's it for this video. Now we're going to be moving from Plato into Descartes, so the next video will be on that. Alright.